Hello, this is Roger Capello bringing you the action from the Wachusett Chess Club and the George Sturgis Memorial. And this will be round two action where I played Tom Fratturelli. Quiet girl. Before I dive into the game here, I realized last week I didn't mention that my little astronomy picture of the day or whatever that I splice in at the side of the board there, in addition to me and Tom, is this week is Saturn. Last week it was actually Mars, even though it looked like it was out west somewhere. It was a landscape from the rover on Mars. This is that interesting hexagonal storm vortex that is at the south pole of Saturn, and there's a oscillation in the wind wave that goes around the pole that causes it then to have this hexagonal appearance. Anyhow, on to the chess. So Tom opened with e4. We've played, I think, 3 times previously, only once with white. And that one game where he had white, he actually drew the game. We had an exchange French, and I kind of don't like the exchange French. It's a little too dry for my taste. So instead of playing a French defense, this week I responded with e5, symmetric king pawn opening. He attacked it with his knight. I defended it. And then he played d4, which is the Scotch opening. I took the pawn, which is the normal line of play against the Scotch. And rather than recapturing, he played bishop to c4, which is the Scotch Gambit, of course. And this is quite an enterprising opening for white. It's not at all easy to meet. I've seen Kasparov play it in St. Louis within the last year. It's my son Rigel used to play this quite a bit. It's a strong opening, and I hadn't actually gotten into this position in a long time, and forgot what the correct line of play is. So I sort of had to dream it up at the board here, but it looks very much like some similar lines in the two knights defense, which I do play from time to time. And so I went ahead and played this knight f6, which is a little bit of a scary looking move because white can immediately attack the knight with his pawn. But it turns out, of course, that black has this rejoinder of d5, playing the pawn to d5. And taking on passant doesn't lead to anything in a special. If white actually takes the knight in this case, unlike in the normal two knights, it's actually a bit of a mistake because the line of play is very simple. Black just goes ahead and captures the bishop. And if white goes ahead and takes the pawn on g7, then black checks to force the queens off and then recaptures the pawn on g7. And black's a pawn ahead and has a very good game. So that's clearly something white doesn't want to do. So instead, Tom correctly played his bishop to b5, pinning my knight. And then I, again, had another fairly long think about whether or not to put my knight onto e4, which seemed like the correct move, but I felt a little overextended there. And instead I went for a line of play with playing the knight back to d7, which seemed cramped, but it looked like I could unwind myself from the cramped position. And it turns out that this line of play actually does a bit better if you look at the statistical databases of master play. This does a bit better than actually playing the knight to e4 for black, even though the knight e4 move is actually made much more often. So Tom went ahead and traded the bishop off, and I recaptured. And I should mention, if I turn on the engine up here, that throughout this game there were an awful lot of moves that where we were following the engine line. So maybe if it's not too disruptive for a while here, I'll leave it going up there, and we can just check to see if how similar we are to actually what's being chosen. For a while there it was mentioning knight takes d4. Now it's wanting to castle immediately. But he went ahead and played knight takes d4. And then it seemed to me, coming into this, that I could get away with taking with the knight on e5, which is what, of course, the engine is agreeing with. And this is nice because it opens up my lines there for my bishop to get out. while at the same time defending that pawn on c6. Now, white has given up the bishop pair, but in so doing has compromised my pawn structure. So that's part of the imbalance in this position. And the question is whether or not I can actually make this pawn on c6 be something that adds to the game instead of just being a liability. And it's pretty mobile. And it's going to be hard to keep it from going to c5, where it will enter the game with force. So I defended the pawn on c6, and he went ahead and castled. Then I found the move queen to f6, which is what the computer likes as well. It's a nice move because not only does it defend my knight, it also defends this pawn another time so that the knight is free to move. And the only sort of downside about it is that it doesn't immediately contribute to getting my king castled. But it turns out that this actually is a point where I leave the chess.com database that they maintain, and the only other game there was one where black played bishop to e7, which I considered, but I ended up liking this move better just because of the flexibility it gave me in protecting the knight and the pawn. It does allow white to immediately start attacking along the e-file, but I have just enough resources to keep myself safe along that file. So he attacks the knight. It's already defended, so I can ignore the attack for now and continue along the path of getting castled. But he can put a second attack on the knight, and then I have to do something about it. But the beauty here is that then I can just drop the knight back to g6, and it defends the bishop as well. Note that, back in this position here, if I had played queen to d6 immediately, the problem with that, of course, is that the knight's defended, but it's also pinned to the king. And f4 at some point, like immediately, could be a serious problem, even though I do have, I can confuse the issue with something like bishop to c5, but then he can just defend that knight with the pawn. And his knight is defended, whereas my knight is still pinned to the king here, and is going to be lost. So that's why I didn't go down that line. Sorry, let's get up to where we are here. Okay, so I, in fact, played bishop to e7 to break the pin on my knight, and so that when he attacked with real force along the e-file, then I was able to drop back with my knight, defending the bishop a third time, but that then, since it's overprotected, allows my king to move. Okay, let's drag this up a bit here. The other thing that knight to g6 does is that it sort of slyly puts an attack on the knight with my queen. It uncovered an attack. Pretty obvious thing, but sometimes people will miss the obvious if they're looking elsewhere. Tom didn't miss it, and he went ahead and defended the knight with a pawn. That's although looks like a solid way to defend it. I think a stronger move at this point would have been to play knight to b3, and the reasoning behind that is, well, it's twofold. One is that the square d4 is really not a stable square for the knight, and it can be attacked easily with pawns and be forced to move. So it's not a long-term address where you want to keep the knight at. And the other thing is putting the pawn on c3, as he did, takes away that square from his knight to develop to. So that is not ideal from that point of view. It's a more restrictive move. I went ahead and castled. He didn't play bishop to e3, no. A good move, the computer, at this point, you really should have played bishop to e3, or something similar. Bishop to e3 is nice because now that the knight is going to have to be developed through, sorry, I'm having problems here finding my cursor. Now that the knight is going to have to be developed through, let's get back here. Okay, Now that this knight is probably going to be developed through d2, you'd rather not lock the bishop in, so it would be nice to get the bishop developed and then play the knight to d2. So that's a logical move order, would be to develop this, instead develop the bishop to e3 first. He didn't do that, and what he did do was to drop the knight back to f3. And I didn't expect him to do that because it allows me to get this strong pin with my bishop. And now there's a possibility for him, which I considered briefly but decided was bad, but which he actually went ahead and did. And that's to attack my queen with the bishop. And this is, superficially, this looks like a nice move for white because it's attacking my bishop after my queen moves. It'll be attacking this bishop that's hiding behind the queen. And his queen and rook are both attacking along the file. It looks like after my queen moves, there will be 3 attacks and only 2 defenses, my knight and my queen, if I say move it to d6. But the problem is that the bishop on g5 is not really defended well. It's defended by this knight, which is pinned to the queen, but that's not an absolute pin. An absolute pin is one which where you're actually pinned to the king, and it'd be an illegal move to move the pinned piece. Here it's just moved to the queen, so it can move. And the knight, particularly whenever you get into these scenarios where the knight could go and attack the black's queen, that's one way to unpin it, is because even though you're opening an attack on your queen, you can attack the opponent's queen. The other time you can unpin it is a situation where you're recapturing a queen. I'm sorry, I'm making this sound more confusing than it is. But the point is that the knight is not really a good defensive piece here. It's actually it's weakened by by being pinned to the queen, and it allows a simple combination of queen takes bishop. And after queen takes bishop, then there's really nothing for white to do. It's pretty much all forced, but you can see the evaluation took a sudden jump now, and he has to play knight takes g5, which is what he did, and then I take his queen, and now the best move is for white to play a desperado. He's losing this knight. If he just goes ahead and takes the bishop, then I take his knight, and he's just lost a whole piece. That's clearly not good. And so instead he plays knight takes h7, since it's going to be lost anyhow. And that attacks my rook. I don't really want him to take this rook over here, so I kind of have to take his knight, and he takes my bishop. And the net result of all of this is that he got back his gambit pawn, but at the cost of a piece. So technically it's a one game for black now, and it's just a question of converting it to the win. Now, it's not only is black ahead by a whole piece, but actually black has quite a good development. This king, even though it's exposed over here on the flank, is not really a problem because there are no queens on the board. It's not really in danger. And what I did at this point was to play bishop to d6, which I wanted to free up my knight so that it didn't have to defend the bishop anymore defensively. But a stronger move at this point, actually now the queen, for a minute there, the computer was saying bishop to d6. Now it's talking about moving the bishop to f6. Another move that it likes is rook to b8. The nice thing about that is that it attacks this b pawn and would prevent him from making the move he does in the game of knight to d2, because that blocks off the defense of the b2 pawn. And instead he'd have to do something about defending that pawn before he moves the knight. Or he could develop the knight through a3 is the other possibility. I did not do that. Instead, I played bishop to d6, which isn't a bad move. I think I'll turn off the engine here, but you could take my word for it. A lot of these moves that we both make actually end up being the engine first choices. But it's getting the CPU a bit overheated and the fans are whirring up and making noise. So after bishop to d6, as I said, Tom was able to play his knight out to d2. And now I can't, what I'd like to do would be to counter the rook along the file, but I can't really do that because if I play rook to e8, now he doubles up on the file. And I mean, I could barricade with a knight, but that's not a stable square, blockading with a knight on e5. And if I trade off a rook, pair of rooks, then I've given up the file because I don't have the support for on e8. So it's not a line that I want to choose to go down. So instead, what I did was to play knight to e5 first, blocking the e file with the idea of at some point then getting my rooks onto the file. And the other idea, of course, here is that if he goes ahead to try to double his rooks, I'll be able to play my knight into d3, and then he'll just have to move the rook away from e1. So after I do this, Tom didn't play to e1, but instead played his rook up to, I think, in a bid to get it active on the king side. I went ahead and attacked the b pawn, hoping to induce a weakness in his pawn structure. I expected that he would maybe play pawn to b3, and then this pawn on c3 here would be no longer supported by a pawn. It would become weaker. That's not what he did. He actually played pawn to b4. And that's better for him in some ways and worse in other ways. It's better in that it does exert some control over the c5 square, but it makes this pawn on c3 even weaker, because it's really backward now. Of course, at this point, playing the knight immediately into that square, even though it's a nice square for the knight, doesn't really make a lot of sense because of knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and now I have these tripled isolated pawns. And if I click on the engine for a second, I still have a decent advantage, but it's less than it was. I mean, I'm a whole piece up, so you'd expect to have some advantage retained. Instead, I moved the knight through g4 to attack the rook, and the idea is to push the rook around and see if I can get him to retreat to e1, at which time then I could play a rook to e8, or otherwise, get him awkwardly positioned on the e file. He doesn't have a lot of squares to go to. E2 is about the only one. Instead, he took the chance to come over and check my king. And this is fine from my point of view, because my king just tucks itself back in on g8, and it's secure there. There's no way he can build up enough pressure to really attack it. And the rook is going to end up being somewhat trapped and misplaced over there on the king side, as it turns out. Okay, let's scroll up a bit here. Okay, he played his knight to f3. Again, this is, it seems like a reasonable square coming after my king side, but it does make it a bit more congested over for his rook, harder to get out. And I was able to immediately grab the e file. He played his knight to d4, where now it's attacking this weak square on c6, but I didn't think he really wanted to get his knight trapped in over here on my king side. So after an immediate c5, if he came in like so to knight c6, attacking my rook, I could have played my rook to a8, and now his knight doesn't have a lot of good squares here. This is quite a high advantage to black at this point. So instead, after I played c5, he went ahead and traded off the pawns, and then that is definitely good, attractive to me, because now my bishop becomes active along a new diagonal. I mean, before it was putting some pressure on h7, but of course the king and rook were able to defend there adequately. Now it's going to end up putting pressure on, I said f7, h7, I meant h2. Now it's going to be putting pressure on f2 if the knight ever moves. So it really ties down the knight. Tom attacked my knight. That was fine with me because it allows me to reposition it back, and then at some point I'll be able to play it forward to e4 again. So it's just a way of getting my knight onto a pathway where I can use squares that his pawns don't control. Okay, he's a little, stuck for moves at this point. So he came over and defended his knight a second time, possibly thinking he could take back with the rook if I took on d4, but he won't be able to until he does something about the last back rank mate threat. So it gave me a chance to play to the 7th rank and attacking his pawn. He took time out to defend the pawn, and now I would like to get my other rook to the 7th rank. So I played bishop takes knight, and as I said before, he can't. Of course, he can't play rook takes because that will end up being mate in just a few moves due to the weak back rank. So instead, he has to take with the c pawn, and then I can play. The knight is no longer controlling that entry square, and I can play my rook up. And I've got a lot of pressure now on f2. He's got to do something about it. What I expected was that he'd play his rook over to f1 to defend it. It's a passive post, but at least it's a strong defense. The other possibility was maybe that he would play the other rook to f3 to defend it. But instead what he chose to do was to play f3. And actually, I think, that struck me as not optimal, but I think I recall now that when I looked at this with, okay, sorry, I'm having trouble finding my cursor. There it is. Looked at this with Stockfish, that f3, was what Stockfish was asking for. But the problem with that is that, it gets the pawn out of harm's way, but now the pawn on g2 is going to have an equal amount of pressure on it. And maybe I can force the rook to abandon it. So I played my knight out to h5. Let's just turn the engine off here. As you can see, the advantage is getting to be pretty big for black at this point. The rook wants to stay on the file in order to defend that pawn. So he came up to g4. I'm able to attack it there. I thought he might play the rook to g5 at this point, but he didn't. Instead, he played a rook over to h4. If he had played rook to g5, let's see. What was I intending? There was, no? Oh, no, I think it was simply to go ahead and play knight f4. Let him take the f pawn because I'm going to come in with probably a mating attack with the 2 rooks and the knight. Or 2 rooks often are not enough to mate the king because you can cause the king to dance back and forth, but you have a hard time actually setting up a mating net. But if you have one other piece, or even a pawn to support one of the rooks, then you can end up mating with the 2 rooks. And so this knight would, if he were to play rook takes pawn, well, this is an immediate checkmate, right? With rook takes knight. Let's see, if he comes there, we have, we can check with the rook, and he can come there. And it's not quite checkmate yet. So it will be next move, or I'll win as rook after knight here. I'm threatening rook to g1. But things like that will happen. So instead, he went back to h4 with the rook. And that then allowed me to capture immediately with the rook and with check, a little Zwischenzug here. the king went to the corner, and then I could just play the pawn up to defend the knight. And now his rook is starting to get into quite an awkward situation. He doesn't have much of a way to get this rook on h4 back into the game. Therefore, he played with the other rook, attacking the c-pawn. He's not really threatening to take it because, actually he is right now, because I'm not threatening mate because, so let's see, if I made a silly move, oh, I don't know, like king f1, just passed, and he took this pawn. This, of course, is not mate, is what I was saying, because he can just take the rook. So because of that reason, I moved my rook back away from his king. And now if he were to take the c-pawn, rook b1 would lead to checkmate. So he can't take the c-pawn. Instead, he came back and threatened my g-pawn. That was fine with me. I just played my king up to defend it. Very stable position over there. Okay. He came back attacking the c-pawn with his rook, and now I do have to worry about it because rook takes pawn as check, and I wouldn't have time to actually checkmate him. He could check me and then go back. I could play king up, but what I did was what the computer suggested, just blocked with the rook. And the idea here is that it's a very difficult line of play for him. So at this point, if you look at the computer analysis, it's up to about -9 or so in black's favor. And the problem is that if he just avoids a capture, he can't use the e-file because my king now has these 3 entry squares controlled, and he can't really afford to play the rook to e5 at any point because the mate threat's on the back rank. This rook that's on h4 really can't get into the game if he plays the pawn forward to try to make an exit path for his rook to come out and over, something like that. Anyhow, when he plays the pawn forward to f4, then the knight will be able to take it. Pawn to f4, and then when the rook moves, the knight will take the pawn. So anyhow, there's no real plan for white here. And on the other hand, there is a plan for black, because if he does something like that, I can just very simply go ahead and come over here and gather up the a pawn, and then maybe gather up the d pawn. A pawn will be enough, because I can then push it to victory here along the a file. So it's a pretty hopeless position for black. So basically what happened then, in this position, is that white resigned. So that was the end of the game. It was a little more fun than the draw last week, and I was glad I got away with it. I didn't mention it when I started this video, but I used to play open games all the time. I like kind of the open board and the tactics, the thrust and cut. Played exclusively e-pawn openings and a lot of e4, e5, that sort of thing. And it was only a couple of years ago that I started playing d-pawn openings, and I've gotten kind of out of the habit of playing those wide open games. So when he chose the Scotch Gambit, I was a bit worried because it was a kind of position that I'm not used to playing anymore, and I felt I could go wrong in pretty easily. One misstep in that kind of open game, and all of a sudden you're doomed. And so I was worried that doom would befall me, but things seemed to break pretty well, and I realized that, gee, when the things go right like that in those open games, it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of nice clean lines and clean tactics as well. So that's it for this week. I'll be back again next week with round 3 from the George Sturgis Memorial. So long.